Okay, so I finished the next blanket that I'm making for to give to Hurricane Harvey victims. I shouldn't say victims, I should say survivors, because they're all going to survive, and that's the wonderful thing. Let me back up a little bit so I can kind of get it in frame. This blanket, again, was made from all scraps and remnants. I did strips, like strip piecing, and I decided when I start doing things like this, I really have no idea in my head at first of what it's going to look like. I just start making pieces, and then I start to get an idea. So I made these right here. I made these strips, and then I cut them down. These are all the same size. I think they're 8.5 inches square. And then I did like what they call a split rail design, which is, you see the strips go one way, then they go the other way. And I made 6 of those, and after you sew the 4 blocks together, it ended up being 16 inches. So I knew I was probably not going to have, I didn't like the look of them right next to each other. It was kind of busy. So I had this scrap of this blue chambray, and it worked out where I had just enough for 3 big 16-inch blocks of that. I did have to sew an extra piece. I had to cut it to fit, but it did work. And but then when I made these 3 strips, I knew that if I did just the 3 strips, it wasn't going to make in my opinion, a long enough blanket. So I went back to the sewing machine, because I still have, as you can see right here, I still have a bunch of strips that I've cut out. And so I just started sewing, and at first what I did was I sewed that row. I had a lot of green, so I decided I just sewed everything in that pile that I had that was green. I sewed a big long line, trimmed them down, and put a row in between. And then I did the same thing right here. These were mainly pinks and reds, and I put that there. And that gave it enough length, in my opinion, to make a good sized blanket. So after I did that, I put the back on, just like the last quilt. This is a blanket. As you can see, this has no batting. We're here in Texas. It doesn't get very cold here. And actually, this is fairly heavy. What I used on the back, this fabric right here is, it's either twill or gabardine. This is actually fashion fabric, but it's a good heavy material that I know will stand up to repeated washings. And so I put that on the back. I had a big giant piece of that, and I still have quite a bit of that green left that I'm going to back several more quilts with. So I did the same thing as I did for the last quilt. All you do is take your quilt top and whatever you're going to use for your back. You put them right sides together, and then you sew like you're sewing a big giant pillow cover. And what I mean by that is you start on one end, like right about here. You go around, 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 around. And then when you get back to this original side, I leave about an 8-inch opening. You don't sew that. You stop there. And then that way you can turn it. So you literally reach into that hole and you pull it back out, right sides out. And then what I did was, all I do after that, and it didn't come out very well, but it'll be fine, is I just sew a top stitch line around and that's only to kind of keep the back from shifting as people use it. I just sew that one line around it, and it makes a nice little blanket. This cost me literally nothing. This was things I already had, scraps that I already had in my scrap bag. Just one of my many scrap bags, and I've had these scraps for years and years, so I'm really glad that I'm actually using them up and making something usable for someone who needs it desperately. Some of this fabric, and as you could see, you don't have to have fancy fabric. This was a big, huge comforter bag full of scraps. Some of these were scraps that I've had. In fact, this bright yellow fabric with the black crows on it, I've used this before in a quilt I made probably 15 years ago. And in fact, when my son saw that, he said, "Mom, you still have that fabric?" So yes, and I'm finally now, and this was good. This was Robert Kaufman fabric. This is very good quality quilting fabric, but it is old. This is at least 15 years old, but it's still cute, and it's still quite serviceable. Some of these, like this fabric is probably not that old. This is also quilt fabric that's probably like 5 to 10 years old that I got in a scrap bag at Goodwill. But some of these things, I mean, like look at this. Some of you may remember the dusty pinks and the dusty blues from the 80s. So this fabric, I can tell you, is probably 20 years old, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's still good fabric. So as you can see, you don't have to have fancy fabric. This is a newer quilt fabric, but this and these two fabrics are at least 20 years old each. And then this is just some little cotton-like fabric that was in the bag, and I used that as well. If it can be washed and dried and hold up, that's what I would say to use. Even if it's fashion fabric, go ahead and use it. And as you can see, I sewed these wonky. Some of these are definitely, but I like that look. I don't like, I don't make precision quilts because I'm not a precision person. I think a quilt, this is a utilitarian quilt. This is a quilt to be used and enjoyed, to cover yourself up while you watch TV, and it's meant to be used until it is worn out. So it doesn't have to be perfect, in my opinion. So I'm really happy. I think this is number 24, sorry, number 24 in the 100 Things Challenge. So with the next item I make, I'll be a fourth done. I'm kind of a slow poke in relation to everybody else, but again, I keep making big items, but I'm really glad I finished this. It ended up being 48 wide by 65 long, and that there is no absolute measurement. Just make. What I do is I sew and make and add to it, and then I hold it up against myself, thinking, I ask myself, how long would I want it to be if it's a blanket to cover me? Now this one's a little bit shorter. The last one was extremely long. This is a little bit shorter, but I'm 5'10". Not everybody's 5'10". Somebody who's 5'4", 5'5", this will be a good sized blanket for them. I did want to show you here, what I do is, as I was cutting the strips out, any of the excess pieces, I just filled a basket here. And what I do is, as I'm sewing, and this is my sewing machine I'm using right now. This is a 1955 sewing machine. I bought this at a thrift shop. I collect vintage sewing machines. Now this one I paid $50 for, and that's actually a lot. I usually pay no more than 10 or 20. This is a workhorse. It's a straight stitch only machine, but I'm only doing straight stitch right now. So don't think, if you want to get into sewing and quilting, that you have to have all these expensive machines. In no way do you have to have that. In fact, look, I mean, it has its own spindle. I don't like to use a spindle, so I bought this little thing at a quilt shop. It's like $10. You can use any thread you want and just use it with any machine. So let's say you'd find a machine, a lot of times the old vintage machines, that the spindle has broken off. Don't let that stop you. If it's a good machine, all you have to do is go to your neighborhood quilt shop and get one of these for about $10. And it's wrought iron, it's metal, it'll last you forever. But I wanted to show, so I have these crumbs, and as I would chain piece these strips. And what chain piecing is let me get you, so like I sewed these two, here's to show you. I sewed these two pieces together, and then I would continually feed two more pieces through without cutting the thread. Chain piecing is very good to do, and it's because thread is expensive. You should try to use the best quality thread you can use, and it can get expensive. So chain piecing, you don't keep having those tails that you have to continually cut off. So what I would do is, when I would get to a row of strips and I wanted to stop, I would grab two little pieces of scrap and I would sew them through and then stop them under the feed dogs. And what that's called is called a crumb quilt. And let me show you. this right here, this I was able to continually sew together and add pieces. And just during this one quilt, when I made this quilt, at just adding pieces to use to stop, it's called leaders and enders. You lead the chain line, or you end the chain line with little scrap pieces, or I could have had little, let's say, 2.5-inch blocks, a pile of them, and I could have stopped with that. It doesn't have to be crumbs, but in that respect, when you do that, what happens is you are literally making 2 quilts at one time, and it's a good time saver. So this just shows you that while I was making this quilt, just by doing that, and then when I would get a piece, I would stop, and then I would make another section, and I'd keep adding to it, and then when I'd put them up together and it looked like they would match, then I would sew them together. But I was able to sew this entire piece, and I'll continually add to this and add to this. And what I'll end up with is another quilt that is really pretty much things that most quilters would throw away. This is crumb. As you can see in here, I mean, I have some small pieces in here. As you can see right here and here, this was when I was evening up a row of strips. This was the little piece that I cut off. But instead of throwing it away, you know what I did? I kept it. And then I sewed it to another piece, and then another piece. And then when I got this many sewn together, I had this piece that was about the same length as these 3 together. So as long as you have one flat side, and let's say your strips and your scraps don't have a straight side, just trim it with your scissors. Just trim the straight sides. Then I sewed this to these 3, and look, and then I made that, and then I added, and then I added, and once I got this piece done, I had already sewed these 2 pieces together, and they were about the same length as this. So then I sewed this to this. Same thing here. So I had this, and I sewed this to this, and as you can see, and then so it literally, you build and you build and you build. And in doing so, that's a good size. This is what a lot of people call it. You're making fabric. You're literally making fabric. I could keep sewing, and this could just be the top. Just all these pieces. But you know what else I could do? I could take my rotary cutter. I could actually take, let's say, a 10-inch block, a 10-inch, measure 10 inches, let's say right here, and cut a piece. And then add a solid fabric block next to it. And then, so I could literally use this and make more blocks to go into another quilt. You don't have to just sew them together. What I'm saying is, you can literally use this now as fabric. Anything that you would use for a fabric. If you want to make a tote bag, you could use this as fabric, and you can make a tote bag. So I wanted to show you that, and I wanted to show you my newest quilt. I know this is not paper crafting, so all my paper crafting friends, and I'm ready to get back to paper crafting, but like I mentioned in the other video, I'm not going to right now. And the reason why is I want to finish out September and try to sew as many of these blankets as I can to give to Hurricane Harvey survivors. I live very close to the cities of Beaumont and Port Arthur. I grew up in Port Arthur, Texas. Whatever that you saw on the news, multiply that by 100, because it is devastating. Just the place where I work at, I have at least 10 fellow employees that lost everything, that their homes were completely destroyed. So if you have any fabric at home, or anything, or even monetary donations, be very careful who you donate to. But people down here desperately need help, and they're going to for a long time, because this hit, a lot of people don't realize this hit 53 counties in Texas. 53 counties in Texas were declared disaster areas from Hurricane Harvey. So it's a very devastating storm, and so I really want to continue with this, but I will get back to my paper crafting. But all my paper crafting friends, you know, if you've thought about sewing, but you think, well, I don't know how to do it. If you can sew a straight line, then you can make a quilt or a blanket like this. If you're afraid of batting, if you're afraid of the idea of quilting, then don't quilt. Do what I did. Just make a blanket. Everybody, you may need a blanket at home. You could make this half this size. Let's say I would have only sewed to about right here and made it that length. This would have been a great blanket to give to somebody who in a nursing home, a great size. And look, it took very little material, and they would really appreciate that. And this being a blanket, this would be good to put over someone that may be in a wheelchair or a bed, and this will hold up to a lot of washings. Anyway, I'm going to let everybody go now. But I just kind of want to show people. And remember, you don't have to have a fancy machine. Just use what you have. And is my stitching perfect? Oh, no, absolutely not. But the thing is, I made it from my heart. It's for use. It's not for hanging on a wall. And I think someone will appreciate having it. I'm really glad you watched my video, and please subscribe if you have not. Thanks a lot, and you have a great day. Bye-bye.